Snow falls on a silent battlefield littered with the wreckage of empires. It is 1919, and the guns of the First World War have gone quiet. But the peace that follows will plant the seeds of an even greater catastrophe. In the halls of Versailles, victors carve up the world and humiliate a defeated nation, never imagining that within 20 years, the fires they lit would consume the entire planet. A failed painter in a Munich beer hall will rise from obscurity to command an empire of terror. A fisherman's son in Italy will march on Rome and call himself Caesar reborn. And across the Pacific, an island nation starved of resources will look upon Asia and sea conquest as its only path to survival. This is not the story of a single war. It is the story of how a broken peace, a global depression, and the ambitions of a few desperate men dragged humanity into the deadliest conflict in history. 60 million lives, 6 years, one world torn apart. This is the complete history of World War II, and it begins not with a bomb but with a signature. The story of the deadliest war in human history does not begin with the roar of tanks or the scream of dive bombers. It begins in a hall of mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, on the 18th of January 1919, where the leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered to decide the fate of a broken world. Germany, exhausted and starving after 4 years of total war, was not invited to negotiate. It was simply handed the terms and told to sign. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of 13% of its territory, all of its overseas colonies, and the vast majority of its military power. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war and its staggering cost. 132 billion gold marks in reparations, a sum so enormous that Germany would still be paying it off nearly a century later. For millions of Germans who had been told by their own generals that the war was not lost on the battlefield, the treaty felt like a betrayal, a stab in the back by weak politicians who had surrendered a war Germany could still have won. This myth, false but powerful, would poison German politics for a generation. The economic consequences arrived swiftly and brutally. By 1923, hyperinflation had reduced the German mark to worthless paper. Workers were paid twice a day because prices doubled by the hour, and children built towers out of banknotes because they were cheaper than firewood. Into this chaos stepped a decorated war veteran named Adolf Hitler, leader of a small nationalist party in Munich called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In November 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in a doomed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed within a day, and Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, of which he served less than 1. In his cell at Landsberg, he dictated a rambling manifesto of hatred and ambition titled Mein Kampf, laying out his vision of racial hierarchy, the destruction of Bolshevism, and the conquest of living space, or Lebensraum, in the East. Released in December 1924, Hitler abandoned the idea of a violent coup and turned instead to the ballot box, rebuilding the Nazi Party into a disciplined political machine. For a few years, Germany stabilized. The mid-1920s saw the Dawes Plan restructure reparations, American loans flow into German industry, and a fragile prosperity return under the Weimar Republic. But this recovery was built on foreign credit, and when Wall Street collapsed in October 1929, the foundation crumbled instantly. American banks called in their loans, German industry collapsed, and unemployment exploded past 6 million by 1932. Nearly a third of the workforce. Democracy itself seemed to be failing. Communists and Nazis fought pitched battles in the streets of Berlin, and desperate voters, terrified of chaos on both extremes, increasingly turned to the one party that promised order, national pride, and a scapegoat for their suffering. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest faction in the Reichstag. On the 30th of January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, believing he could control the Bohemian corporal, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler moved with astonishing speed to dismantle democracy itself. Weeks after his appointment, the Reichstag building burned in a fire the Nazis blamed on communist saboteurs. Hitler used the crisis to push through the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties, followed by the Enabling Act of March 1933, which allowed him to rule by decree without parliamentary approval. Within months, all other political parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and the first concentration camp opened at Dachau to imprison political opponents. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declared himself Führer, and required every soldier in the German military to swear a personal oath of loyalty not to the Constitution, but to him alone. Meanwhile, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels built a cult of personality through radio, film, and mass rallies at Nuremberg, while the SS under Heinrich Himmler grew into a state within a state. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship and forbade marriage between Jews and non-Jews, formalizing a racial persecution that would escalate toward genocide. While Germany rebuilt its power in secret, defying the disarmament clauses of Versailles by rearming in violation of international law, a similar transformation was underway in Italy. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist journalist turned nationalist agitator, had founded the fascist movement in 1919, promising to restore the glory of ancient Rome. In October 1922, his black shirt followers marched on Rome, and King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, invited Mussolini to form a government rather than resist him. Mussolini gradually dismantled Italian democracy, banned opposition parties, and styled himself Il Duce, the leader. Seeking to prove Italy's imperial credentials, he ordered an invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935. Despite Ethiopian resistance, Italian forces used poison gas and modern weaponry against a poorly equipped army, and by May 1936, Ethiopia had fallen. The League of Nations condemned the invasion but imposed only weak sanctions, revealing the collective security system's fatal impotence. Mussolini and Hitler, once wary of each other, drew closer, and in 1936 they proclaimed the Rome-Berlin Axis. That same year, Spain descended into civil war after a group of nationalist generals, led by Francisco Franco, rose against the democratically elected Republican government. Hitler and Mussolini seized the opportunity to test their new weapons and tactics, sending the Condor Legion and Italian expeditionary forces to support Franco. The bombing of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937, which killed hundreds of civilians in a coordinated aerial attack, shocked the world and inspired Pablo Picasso's famous painting, but it also demonstrated the terrifying potential of air power against civilian populations, a preview of horrors to come. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, supported the Republicans, turning Spain into a proxy battlefield for the ideological struggle that would soon engulf the entire continent. Franco's nationalists won in 1939, establishing a fascist-aligned dictatorship that would endure for decades, though Spain itself would remain formally neutral in the coming World War. On the other side of the globe, Japan pursued its own path toward militarism and conquest. Lacking natural resources and facing a population it believed could not be sustained on its home islands, Japan's military leadership increasingly dominated civilian government through assassination and intimidation. In September 1931, the Japanese Guandong Army staged an explosion on a South Manchurian railway line, the Mukden Incident, as a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the aggression. Japan simply withdrew from the League rather than comply. 6 years later, in July 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing escalated into full-scale war. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, and in December 1937, they captured the Chinese capital of Nanjing. What followed was one of the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century. Over 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers massacred an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, and committed mass sexual violence against tens of thousands of women. The Nanjing Massacre became a searing symbol of the brutality that would define the Pacific War, and its memory remains a source of profound tension between China and Japan to this day. Back in Europe, Hitler tested how far the Western democracies would let him go. In March 1936, he ordered German troops to reoccupy the demilitarized Rhineland, in direct violation of Versailles. France and Britain, unwilling to risk war, did nothing. In March 1938, Hitler annexed his native Austria in the Anschluss, uniting it with Germany to enthusiastic crowds in Vienna. He then turned to Czechoslovakia, demanding the German-speaking Sudetenland region on the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans there. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid a repeat of the First World War slaughter, flew to Munich in September 1938 and, together with France and Italy, agreed to hand Hitler the Sudetenland without even consulting the Czechoslovak government. Chamberlain returned to London waving the agreement and declaring peace for our time. Winston Churchill, then a lonely voice in the political wilderness, warned that Britain had been offered a choice between war and dishonor, and had chosen dishonor, and would get war anyway. He was proven right within 6 months, when in March 1939 Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia outright, revealing that his ambitions were never limited to ethnic Germans but aimed at conquest itself. With Czechoslovakia's formidable defenses and armaments industry now in German hands, Hitler turned his gaze toward Poland, demanding the return of the free city of Danzig and access across the Polish corridor. This time, Britain and France drew a line, pledging military support to Poland if it were attacked. But Hitler had one more diplomatic masterstroke to play. On the 23rd of August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological archenemies, stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Stalin, distrustful of British and French intentions and eager to buy time to rebuild his purge-weakened military, agreed to stand aside while Hitler moved against Poland, in exchange for Soviet control over eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland and Romania. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was free to strike. At dawn on the 1st of September 1939, without a declaration of war, German forces crossed the Polish border. It was the debut of a terrifying new form of warfare that the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast-moving panzer divisions punched through Polish lines, while the Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers, fitted with screaming sirens designed purely to terrorize, pulverized roads, railways, and civilian columns ahead of the advance. Poland's cavalry-heavy army, brave but hopelessly outmatched in technology and doctrine, fought valiantly but could not withstand the combined assault. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded from the east as agreed under the secret pact, crushing Poland in a pincer between two totalitarian powers. Warsaw fell by the end of the month. Britain and France, honoring their guarantee, declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. The Second World War in Europe had formally begun, though for months afterward, an eerie calm settled over the Western Front, a period so quiet that journalists dubbed it the phony war. The calm shattered in the spring of 1940. In April, Germany invaded Denmark, which surrendered within hours, and Norway, where fierce fighting continued for 2 months before Allied forces withdrew. Then, on the 10th of May 1940, Hitler unleashed his main offensive in the West, invading the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France simultaneously. Where Allied planners expected a repeat of the First World War's slow grind through Belgium, German panzer divisions instead punched through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, catching the French and British completely by surprise and racing to the English Channel within days, cutting off the bulk of the Allied armies in Belgium. Trapped against the sea at the French port of Dunkirk, over 300,000 British and French soldiers faced annihilation or capture, until, in one of the war's most remarkable episodes, a hastily assembled fleet of Royal Navy vessels and hundreds of civilian little ships, fishing boats and pleasure craft, evacuated the trapped troops across the Channel between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940. It was a staggering deliverance, though Churchill himself warned Parliament that wars are not won by evacuations. France collapsed with shocking speed. German forces entered Paris on the 14th of June, and on the 22nd, French officials signed an armistice in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. A deliberate humiliation orchestrated by Hitler himself. France was divided, the North and Atlantic coast under direct German occupation, and a nominally independent southern rump state governed from the town of Vichy under the aging Marshal Philippe Pétain, a state that would collaborate extensively with Nazi policies, including the deportation of Jews. Across the Channel, Britain now stood alone against the full weight of Nazi Germany, with Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister on the very day the Western offensive began, rallying his nation with the defiant promise that Britain would fight on the beaches and never surrender. Hitler, hoping Britain might still sue for peace, was surprised by its continued resistance and began preparing Operation Sea Lion, a planned invasion across the Channel. But first, the Luftwaffe would need to win control of the skies. Through the summer and autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain raged in the air above southern England, as young Royal Air Force pilots, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes and guided by the newly developed technology of radar, fought desperately against overwhelming numbers of German bombers and fighters. Churchill would famously declare that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The RAF's resilience, combined with a critical German strategic error, shifting bombing raids from RAF airfields to the terror bombing of London and other cities during the Blitz, which killed tens of thousands of civilians but failed to break British morale, ultimately forced Hitler to postpone and then abandon the invasion of Britain indefinitely. It was the first major strategic defeat of Nazi Germany, and it kept Britain in the war as a base from which the Allies would eventually strike back. Elsewhere, Mussolini, eager to match Hitler's conquests, launched ill-fated invasions of Greece and British-held Egypt in the autumn of 1940, both of which quickly turned into humiliating setbacks that forced Hitler to divert German forces into the Balkans and North Africa to rescue his faltering ally. A diversion of resources and, crucially, of time that would later prove costly when Hitler turned his attention toward his ultimate ideological target, the Soviet Union. Across the Atlantic, the United States, though officially neutral, increasingly tilted toward the Allied cause. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, recognizing Britain's desperate need for supplies but constrained by American isolationist sentiment and the Neutrality Acts, engineered the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, allowing the United States to supply Britain, and later the Soviet Union and China, with vast quantities of war material without requiring immediate payment. Roosevelt described it as lending your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire. By the spring of 1941, the world stood at a hinge point. Britain had survived its darkest hour, but the war's true global explosion was still to come, in the endless steppes of Russia, and in the waters of the Pacific, where a devastating surprise attack would soon bring the United States roaring into the conflict. The fire that had been contained to Europe was about to become a world war in truth. But in Berlin, Hitler's gaze had already turned east, toward the vast plains of the Soviet Union and the ideological war he had always intended to fight. A war that would become the largest and most brutal military campaign in human history.